On the night they were supposed to honor me, a man at the table leaned toward his friend and said loud enough for three more to hear, "Careful, if he talks too long, we'll need subtitles." The laughter was quick, practiced, the kind that makes people feel safe in their smallness. I felt the heat rise, not the kind from shame, but the kind from every border I'd crossed, every form I'd filled, every word I'd rehearsed in the mirror until my mouth ached. The community awards banquet was a room I had earned my way into, not begged for. Still, as I stepped forward to greet the room, a waiter brushed past and repeated my greeting under his breath, stretching my vowels until they snapped into something ugly. The clink of glasses covered his smirk. My fingers itched to leave, to let the night close behind me like a door slammed in my face. But I stood there, letting the seconds crawl, because walking out would make their joke true, that I did not belong here, that I could be pushed back into the shadows with nothing more than a cheap imitation of my voice. So I smiled, a quiet smile with teeth behind it, and took my seat. The applause for the next speaker roared in my ears like static. Somewhere deep in my chest, a decision was beginning to form, and it sounded nothing like retreat. Friends, let's take a short pause. Write in the comments, where are you listening from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow our channel. And now, we continue. The lights dimmed, and the screen at the front of the banquet hall came alive with photographs, smiling faces of donors, shaking hands, cutting ribbons. One by one, their names bloomed in bold letters, applause swelling at each familiar face. I waited. I had given quietly, without ceremony, without insisting on credit, because I believed the cause was bigger than my name. But still, I had given more than most of the people now beaming from the screen. The slides kept rolling. My seat felt harder beneath me. Then the screen went black, the lights came back up, and the room moved on. My name had never appeared. My contribution, half the scholarship fund that would send young people to universities I could only dream of at their age, was invisible, not even a mention in passing. I found the organizer in the crowd during a lull, their smile tight, their gaze restless. "An oversight," they said, already turning toward someone more important in their eyes. Oversight. As if my name had simply fallen between the cracks, not been quietly swept there. I returned to my seat, but not the one I'd started in. I slipped into the last row, the one closest to the exit, where the air from the hallway crept in cold and unnoticed. From there I could see the backs of heads, the gleam of wine glasses, the easy way people acknowledged each other as if the rest of us didn't exist. The program moved forward, cheerful and unbothered, while I sat in that draft, feeling the kind of absence that isn't empty, but full of all the things people choose not to see. In the hum of the speeches, I thought about the students who would benefit from the scholarship. Their faces were the reason I'd given, and they didn't need to know my name. But the ones in this room, the ones who thought they owned the stage, the story, and the spotlight, needed to know. And something in me decided they would. Not tonight, maybe. But before this evening's lights went dark, I would no longer be the ghost they expected me to be. Between speeches, while the chatter in the room rose and fell like the clinking of cutlery, my nephew slid into the chair beside me. He was dressed sharply, the kind of confidence you can rent from a tailor for the night, his eyes darting between the stage and me. He leaned in close, the smell of cologne trying to mask a tremor in his voice. He said I might consider letting others speak, that maybe tonight wasn't the best time for me to take the microphone. He didn't say, because of your accent. He didn't have to. The pause after "people won't get you" was heavy enough to carry the meaning. It was the kind of wound I'd been dealt before, not from strangers, but from those who shared my blood. I had heard it in different forms over the years. A cousin telling me to just blend in at a wedding, an uncle suggesting I let my wife handle the talking at business dinners, a neighbor offering to translate my own sentences back into the language I was already speaking. Each time it chipped at something deep, an old fracture that had never healed straight. Hearing it from my nephew made that fracture ache again. I looked at him, this young man who had grown up in a world where my sacrifices had bought him fluency and comfort, where my long hours and careful budgeting had made college possible without him ever knowing the weight of the bills. He thought he was helping me avoid embarrassment. He didn't understand that asking me to stay silent was the greater humiliation. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because the moment to teach him the truth wasn't here. Not yet. He took my nod as permission, relief softening his shoulders as he turned back to the stage. He didn't see the way my jaw set, or how my hands curled under the table, gripping the edge until my knuckles whitened. In the noise of the next introduction, I heard my grandmother's voice, the one that used to push me forward into rooms where I was the only one who sounded like me. If you let them quiet you, they'll believe they were right to. I sat there, in the dim light of the back row, my nephew's well-meaning betrayal still ringing in my ears, and knew that before the night was over, I would speak. Not for their approval, not even for my own defense, but because silence had never once earned me the dignity my voice could claim in a single breath. The MC's voice rose above the low murmur of the crowd, bright and practiced, the kind of tone that knew how to charm a room without ever touching its truth. "And now," he said, "we extend our gratitude to our anonymous supporters, those who have given quietly, without seeking recognition." There was a polite smattering of applause, light and fleeting, the sound of hands touching only out of habit. It landed in the air and went nowhere, like raindrops on glass. I kept my hands still in my lap. Not clapping wasn't defiance. It was simply the truest gesture I could offer in that moment. My contribution was not anonymous by choice. It had been made invisible for me. And now they were wrapping my erasure in silk, calling it humility, as if they were doing me a favor by pretending I'd chosen to be unnamed. The room felt smaller suddenly, though it was a grand hall with high ceilings and polished chandeliers. The tables seemed closer, the air heavier, the lights warmer in a way that pressed instead of comforted. I could feel the weight of their version of my story settling on me like a lid, something meant to keep me contained, present but silent, appreciated in theory but never allowed to exist fully in their view. I shifted slightly in my chair, trying to breathe past the tightness in my chest. And as I did, I reached deeper, not into the shallow air of the banquet hall, but into the place inside me where voices from another time still lived. My mother, sitting at the kitchen table in the half-light of early morning, telling me to read aloud from a newspaper she could barely afford. My father, after long shifts, correcting my pronunciation gently, never mocking my mistakes, telling me to try again until the sentence felt like it belonged in my mouth. My grandmother, whose accent was heavier than mine could ever be, standing in line at a government office and speaking without flinching, even when the clerk rolled her eyes. They had all taught me the same thing, though in different ways, that a voice is not just a way to be heard, it is a way to exist. And when someone tries to take it from you, they are not just silencing words. They are trying to erase proof that you belong here at all. I sat in that polite cage, listening to the applause fade, the room shifting back to its comfortable rhythm. But under the weight of that lid, something inside me had started to press upward. I didn't yet know what shape it would take, but I knew this. Before the night ended, I would not leave it sealed. Near the back of the hall, just past the edge of the tables where the servers moved like shadows, a bar had been set up for those who preferred liquor to the slow flow of speeches. I wasn't looking for trouble when I glanced in that direction. I was simply tracing the edges of the room, mapping its exits, its corners, the faces that avoided meeting mine. But then I heard it, my own greeting, repeated in a voice that bent it into something foreign even to me. The consonants were pulled long and clumsy, vowels punched hard in all the wrong places, as if my first words to the room had been some kind of party trick. Laughter broke out, quick, sharp, the kind that doesn't care who it cuts. One of them was a board member, a man whose handshake was always heavy, with the kind of authority that comes from being needed but never questioned. The other, God help me, was someone who had once stood in my kitchen, asking for my help to secure funding for his own project. I had vouched for him, spent weeks making calls, pulling strings I had kept in reserve for something that mattered. And now he was here, raising his glass not to an achievement or a cause, but to the sound of my voice turned into a punchline. The laughter from the bar spread just far enough to catch a few more ears, pulling them into its orbit. Their heads turned slightly, curious, entertained, but careful not to make eye contact with me. There was an ease to it, the way cruelty disguised itself as humor, the way the line between amusement and contempt blurred when people thought they were safe from consequence. I could have turned away. I could have stared down at my plate, let the moment pass like an unpleasant smell that would fade with time. Instead, I let my gaze travel upward, past the shimmer of crystal glasses and the sheen of tailored suits, until it found the steady, impersonal glow of the chandelier above. I fixed my eyes on it, as if it were an anchor, and began to count silently, 1 to 10, in my mother tongue. The numbers were slow, deliberate, each one steadying me like the measured beat of a drum. I thought of the first time I'd learned to count like that. My grandmother's hands guiding mine over the shells she used as teaching tools. The rhythm of her voice making the foreign feel like home. I thought of how every syllable carried the weight of generations who had spoken them before me, not in banquet halls, but in fields, in kitchens, in border checkpoints where speaking too fast or too slow could mean the difference between passage and refusal. By the time I reached 10, the laughter at the bar had softened into the low hum of conversation. They had moved on, but I had not. The moment had lodged itself somewhere deep, not as pain exactly, but as fuel. And while they toasted their own wit, I sat in the back row, feeling the slow burn of a resolve they could not hear. They believed the room was theirs. By the end of the night, I intended to prove them wrong. The speeches blurred together after that. Polished words from polished mouths, each one rolling out in a smooth cadence that fit neatly into the expectations of the room. I sat there, letting the sound wash over me without hearing it, the weight of everything that had happened tonight pressing against my ribs like a stone I couldn't shift. My nephew's warning, the absent slide, the applause for anonymous generosity, the mocking at the bar, each one a thread, and together they had been weaving something I could no longer ignore. I could go home, slip back into the safety of my own walls, and pretend this evening had been nothing more than another bruise to carry quietly. I could swallow it like I had so many times before, let the bitterness dissolve slowly until I could convince myself it had lost its taste. That would be easier. It would also be exactly what they wanted. The truth was, silence had been my survival for years. It had gotten me through border crossings, job interviews, where my qualifications were weighed against my accent, parent-teacher meetings, where my presence was treated as a formality rather than a right. Silence had kept me from being thrown out of rooms. But tonight, silence felt less like protection and more like surrender. And I realized, with a sudden clarity that made my chest ache, that I could not, would not let them decide how I would leave this room. My palms were damp, my heart thudding so hard I could feel it in the tips of my fingers. The chair beneath me suddenly felt like a shackle, holding me in place. I pushed it back, the scrape of wood against polished floor slicing through the murmur of conversation. A few heads turned, their expressions politely curious, as if they were waiting to see who I was about to greet or what drink I was going to fetch. But I didn't move toward the exit. I straightened my back, letting the air fill my lungs all the way to the bottom, and felt the trembling in my hands settle into something steadier, not confidence, not yet, but the decision to try. The room smelled of champagne and perfumed air, but beneath it all, I caught a faint scent of the coat I was wearing, still marked with the soap from my home. I belonged here as much as anyone else breathing in this air, and the fact that they didn't see it yet was exactly why I needed to stand. I took my first step toward the front, feeling the warmth of 100 eyes beginning to gather on me. Some expectant, some indifferent, some, though they didn't know it yet, about to be changed. And as I walked, I understood something I had never quite admitted to myself. Courage doesn't come when you're unafraid. It comes when the fear is still there, and you rise anyway. Tonight, I would rise. The stage was not mine to take. I knew that. There was a program, a schedule, a list of approved speakers whose names were printed neatly in the evening's brochure. Mine was not among them, but the weight in my chest had become too heavy to carry back to my seat, and the thought of going home with it pressed against my ribs felt like a defeat I could never forgive myself for. So I kept walking, each step a quiet rebellion against the order of the night. The MC was mid-sentence, caught off guard as I moved past him. There was a flicker in his eyes. Confusion, then hesitation, then the faint tightening of someone trying to decide whether to stop me or simply let the moment play out. I didn't wait for his permission. I reached the lectern, my fingers brushing the cool edge of it as if it might steady me. The microphone stood there like a challenge, its metal stem cold under my hand. I leaned in, close enough for my breath to catch the surface of it, and said, "Good evening." The word rolled out, carrying the cadence of my homeland, the vowels shaped not by this country's mouth, but by the one that had raised me. The sound surprised even me, rounder, fuller, as if my voice had been waiting all night to breathe in its own language before being filtered through another's rules. The microphone caught it and threw it back to me with an echo that seemed louder than it should have been. Conversations faltered, glasses paused halfway to lips. A hush began to settle over the room, tentative at first, as if they were still deciding whether this was worth their attention. I could feel the stares now, some curious, some wary, a few already braced for amusement. They didn't know what I was going to say. They thought perhaps it would be a thank you, a harmless anecdote, something they could nod through while thinking about dessert. But the hush grew heavier with each breath I took, as if the air itself was beginning to understand that something unexpected had entered the room. For a brief second I thought of all the times I had bitten back my words, at meetings, in interviews, in social gatherings where my voice was tolerated but not welcomed. All those swallowed sentences, those moments of compliance had been leading here. I stood a little taller, letting the truth of my posture match the truth of my voice. I scanned the room, not looking for approval but for recognition. The kind that says, "I see you fully," without trimming the edges to make you fit. And though most faces were blank, I saw one or two leaning in, caught in the rhythm of my accent, like it was music they hadn't heard before. The hush held, gathering weight, pressing down not to silence me, but to listen. And for the first time that night, the room felt balanced. Not theirs, not mine, but a space where we both stood. I let the quiet stretch a little longer before I spoke again, knowing that this pause was not empty. It was the sound of the walls shifting. I began where the journey truly began. Not with me, but with the people whose footsteps I still follow, whose sacrifices became the bricks under every road I have walked. My voice was steady now, but each word was chosen with the precision of someone carrying crystal through a crowd, aware that even the smallest misstep could shatter the meaning. I told them about my grandmother, who once owned gold bangles heavy enough to clink when she moved her hands, the last remnants of a family's better days. When the choice came between keeping those bangles and buying the bus fare that would carry her children toward the possibility of a safer life, she loosened them from her wrists without ceremony. I spoke of how she never once called it a loss, only a trade. "Jewelry can be replaced," she used to say. "A future cannot." I told them about my father, a man who could barely speak the new language when we arrived, but who mastered the universal one, numbers. He worked in a shop where the only thing more precise than his bookkeeping was his silence. He learned the cost of every item, the shape of every coin, before he could confidently ask for the time. In the evenings he would pass his hands over receipts as if they were braille, reading survival in the neat rows of figures. And I told them about my mother, whose voice rarely rose above the volume of a secret, but whose whispers held more courage than many men's shouts. She would lean close to me before school, knowing the day ahead might be full of mispronounced names, quick jokes, the slow erosion of belonging. "Walk in like you belong," she'd say, her tone soft but absolute. "Let them learn you by your staying." The room was quiet in a way it hadn't been all evening. Every sentence I gave them was deliberate, weighted with the memory of the hands that had lifted me here. My pauses were not the fumbling gaps of a man searching for words, but the kind of silences that carry their own meaning, spaces where the truth could settle in and take shape. I let the air between us grow heavy when I spoke of the train station, where my grandmother stood waving as the bus pulled away, of the cramped apartment where my father first counted his pay, of the kitchen where my mother's voice wrapped itself around my fears until they fit in my pocket instead of my chest. I could feel the shift. The polite curiosity was gone. In its place was something slower, deeper, almost reverent. Even those who had laughed earlier were leaning forward now, caught in the cadence of a story that didn't ask for their approval, only their presence. In telling them about the border, I was reminding them, and myself, that every accent carries a map. Mine was drawn in sacrifice, in resilience, in the quiet defiance of people who refused to be erased. And tonight, that map was spread wide across the room for everyone to see. I let the next pause stretch until the room's stillness felt like it had a pulse of its own. Then I looked out at them, not just at their faces, but at the space between us, the invisible wall I'd been made to feel since the moment I walked in. My voice was quieter now, but the kind of quiet that draws people closer rather than pushing them away. "An accent," I said slowly, "is a map of where the soul has traveled." The words landed differently than anything I had said before, not as a defense, not as a plea, but as a truth too steady to be shaken. A few faces tilted, as if trying to hear the meaning from another angle. Somewhere near the back, the waiter who had mocked my greeting earlier stopped mid-step. His tray balanced perfectly still. The rhythm of the room had broken. Even those who had spent the night half listening were leaning in, not because they wanted to be polite, but because something in them wanted to understand. I spoke into the silence that followed, letting the edges of my vowels carry not just sound, but memory. I told them that every syllable I spoke was a compass point, every rolled R a reminder of the roads I had walked, every softened consonant a hill or river crossed. That my voice carried not only the country I came from, but the places I had passed through, the nights I had stayed awake practicing words until they stopped feeling like strangers in my mouth. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my nephew. His shoulders were tense, his eyes locked on me. He wasn't holding up his phone to record. There was no gleam of the camera's red light. His hand was shaking, and he had lifted the device only to give it something to hold on to. He was steadying himself, anchoring against a tide he hadn't expected to feel. I could almost read the thoughts in his face, the echo of his earlier warning for me not to speak, the collision of embarrassment and pride, the slow realization that the thing he had feared would diminish me was the very thing beginning to make the room listen. The air was thick now, not with discomfort, but with a kind of recognition, even from those who didn't want to admit it. I let my gaze sweep over them, past the donors at the bar, past the organizers who had skipped my name, past the rows of polite smiles, and I saw for a flicker of a moment something shift in their eyes. Not all of them, not completely, but enough. I stood there, hands resting lightly on the lectern, feeling the truth of it rise in me. They could laugh at my words, ignore my name, erase me from their programs, but they could not erase the journey my voice carried. And for the first time that night, I felt them begin to see it too. Somewhere near the front, a cough broke the stillness, but it stumbled over itself, failing to disguise the nerves behind it. It wasn't the easy, dismissive kind, meant to cut through a speech. It was the sound of someone trying to hide the fact that they'd been caught listening more closely than they wanted to. In the corner of the room, the board member at the bar, the one who had raised his glass to my voice earlier in mockery, lowered it slowly. His drink hovered just above the counter, his eyes fixed on me with an expression that couldn't quite decide between curiosity and discomfort. I didn't give them time to retreat into their old armor. I let the moment hang for just a breath before I went on. I told them about the day I arrived in this country with 2 suitcases, one filled with clothes, the other with things too small to fill space, but too important to leave behind. A photograph of my parents on their wedding day, a worn leather-bound notebook with my grandmother's handwriting, and a battered dictionary that had already been opened so many times the spine no longer held straight. That dictionary had been my bridge and my battlefield. I told them how, in those first years, I mispronounced almost everything, including the word hope. I had said it wrong for months, shaping the vowel as I would have back home, until one day someone corrected me, not unkindly, but in a way that made me feel like I'd been holding the wrong key to the right door. So I practiced it, quietly, late at night, repeating it until it began to feel less like a foreign object, and more like something that could live in my own mouth. Over time, it stopped being just a word. It became a response, an instinct, something that didn't need translation anymore. And as I spoke, I didn't just tell them about learning their language. I told them about the weight of doing so while trying not to lose my own. How I had walked into rooms where I understood every sentence, but still knew I was not understood in return. How I had smiled through conversations where my words were repeated back to me more slowly, as if they were fragile and might break before they reached the listener's ears. How I had carried the ache of that invisibility like a second skin. The room was so still now, I could hear the faint hum of the lights above me. No one was shifting in their seat. No one was pretending to check their phone. And yet, it wasn't the silence of polite endurance. It was the silence of something starting to crack. That first fracture in the room had formed, small but undeniable, and it spread with every sentence I spoke. I knew then that I had passed a point of no return. They could choose not to applaud. They could look away when I stepped down. They could even pretend later that this moment had not happened. But they could not unhear what I had just given them. And for the first time tonight I felt the ground tilt, not beneath me, but beneath them. The door at the far end of the hall opened with the faintest sound, but in the stillness it might as well have been a hinge on a cathedral. A man stepped in, moving with the unhurried ease of someone accustomed to arriving late without apology. His suit was the kind that never wrinkled, his shoes polished enough to catch the low light. A plastic name tag hung from a ribbon around his neck, turned inward so that the writing faced his chest. It was a small detail, but it told me everything. This was someone who didn't need an introduction, someone whose presence alone was meant to speak for him. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room, not for a seat but for the pulse of the moment. His eyes caught on me at the lectern, and I saw him do something subtle but telling. He straightened. Not the mechanical posture of politeness, but the small shift of a man recognizing he has walked into something worth hearing. He stayed near the back, attention turned outward, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. I didn't know his title yet, but I knew the type. He had probably sat through 10,000 speeches, each one polished, rehearsed, stripped of anything that might be considered risk. He had heard voices that chased perfection so hard they left their humanity behind. But as I spoke, I saw it in his face. This was different to him. And then I understood why. He recognized the geography inside my words. Not the content alone, but the landscape beneath it. The long roads carved by necessity, the unpaved crossings between one life and another, the way the air changes when you stand at a border, and your future depends on how a single sentence leaves your lips. I was speaking in a tongue that, though shaped differently from his own, carried a terrain he had walked in some form. My voice, thick with the soil of another country, was not an obstacle for him to get past. It was a map he already knew how to read. In his eyes I saw the faint glimmer of recognition, the kind that says, I know this ground. I've stood here too. For a moment, I let myself imagine that the rest of the room could see me as he did, not as an interruption to the evening's program, but as the rightful center of it. And maybe they could, if they were willing to listen as he was listening now. The thought steadied me, not because I needed his validation, but because it reminded me that even in a crowd designed to forget you, there will always be someone who remembers where you come from and knows it matters. So I kept going, letting my words stretch further. deeper, until they reached even the back wall where he stood. His gaze never wavered, and in that silent connection, I felt the truth of why I was here. Not to be heard by everyone, but to be understood by those who could see the map in my voice and recognize it as a place worth honoring. I let the next sentence come slowly, heavy with the weight of all the silences I had carried to this moment. "Tonight," I said, my eyes sweeping the room so no one could pretend I wasn't speaking to them, "scholarships will carry names, not numbers. Make mine visible." The air shifted. It wasn't just quiet. It was charged, as if the very walls had been pulled into listening. I lifted my hand and gestured toward the massive screen, still glowing behind me, where the images of smiling donors had rolled past earlier without a trace of me among them. The gesture wasn't sharp or angry. It was deliberate, undeniable, the way a witness points out the truth in a courtroom. For a second, the MC stood frozen in place, one hand resting on the microphone stand he had abandoned when I stepped forward, his mouth slightly open as if caught between an apology and an excuse. At the side of the stage, the technician hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, eyes flicking toward the organizers for permission that wasn't coming. And then perhaps because the silence had grown too heavy to bear, perhaps because even in this room some instincts lean toward what is right, the technician began to move. Keys clicked, a shuffle of files, the faint whir of the projector resetting. The screen flickered, and for a heartbeat it went black. Then my name appeared, not just in the middle of the slide, but in bold, unbroken letters, spelled correctly. No abbreviations, no convenient trimming of syllables to make it easier on unfamiliar tongues. My name in full, the way my grandmother would have said it, the way my father signed it, the way I had learned to write it before I could read. The room's new silence was unlike any that had come before. Earlier, their quiet had been the stillness of doubt, of polite tolerance, of people waiting for me to finish. Now it was different. It was the stillness of acknowledgement, the awareness that something had shifted and could not shift back. No one clapped. No one needed to. The absence of movement was its own kind of applause. I let my eyes rest on the slide for a moment longer, then back to the audience. My voice was steady when I spoke again. "If you forget the name," I said, "you forget the story. And if you forget the story, the scholarship becomes just money. And money alone has never changed a life." I could see it then. Some faces holding my gaze longer than they would have an hour ago. Some shifting uncomfortably as if their own reflections had caught them off guard. My name was still on the screen, glowing over my shoulder, and for the first time that night, it felt like the room could not look past me, not because I had forced my way in, but because I had taken back what was mine. And once taken back, it could not be erased again. From the back of the room, movement caught my eye, not the restless shifting of someone eager for the evening to end, but the deliberate, unhurried rise of a man who knew exactly what his gesture would mean. The diplomat stood without waiting for applause, without glancing around to see if anyone else would follow. No protocol, no ceremony, just the quiet authority of someone who understood that some moments ask for action, not permission. He stepped into the aisle, his polished shoes striking the floor in a rhythm that seemed to echo louder than the polite clinking of cutlery had all night. The crowd turned in unison to watch him, the way people instinctively turn toward weather they can feel approaching. His face was steady, his gaze locked on me, as if every step was closing a distance much larger than the space between the back wall and the lectern. When he reached me, he didn't offer the flat, single-handed shake of habit. He took my hand in both of his, holding it as though it were not just a greeting, but a declaration. His palms were warm, his grip steady, not crushing, not performative, but the kind that said, "I see you, and I will make sure others do too." And then he spoke my name, slowly, clearly, with the exact weight and music it carried when my grandmother said it, when my mother called me in from the street, when I whispered it to myself before walking into rooms where I knew I'd be the only one like me. He said it not like it was a label to get through, but as if it were a place, a country whole and worth defending. The syllables filled the air, rich and intact, and for the first time that evening, I heard my name bounce back from the walls without distortion. The silence in the room deepened, not from discomfort, but from gravity. People were no longer watching politely. They were witnessing. The diplomat didn't release my hands right away. He looked at me in a way that made it clear this was not for show, not for cameras, not even for the people in the room. It was an act between two people who recognized the landscapes in each other's voices. Only when he finally let go did the shift ripple through the rest of the audience. It wasn't laughter now, not even scattered clapping. It was something heavier. Heads bowed slightly, postures straightened, eyes no longer darting away. No one needed to be told to quiet down. No one needed to be reminded that this was not the moment for jokes. They had laughed at my voice before. Now they were carrying the sound of my name in theirs, holding it with a care they hadn't thought to give it earlier. And I knew, as I stood there, with the echo of his pronunciation still hanging in the air, that something fundamental in this room had shifted for good. The diplomat had barely returned to his place at the back when I saw movement again, this time from the corner near the bar. The board member, the same man who had once lifted his glass in mockery of my voice, was walking toward me. His steps were slower, less certain than the diplomat's, as if each one had to push through a thick tangle of pride and discomfort. His eyes met mine briefly, then slipped away, only to return again, as though he was forcing himself to look at something he had avoided seeing all evening. When he finally stood before me, there was a stiffness in his shoulders that betrayed the weight of what he was about to say. The words started, caught in his throat, shifted, and began again. Whatever sentence he had prepared in his mind was fighting with the part of him that still wanted to protect his own dignity. But in the end, something gave way. The apology came, not dressed in excuses, not softened by clever phrasing, but plain and raw. It wasn't eloquent. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of apology that costs a person something to speak aloud. Before I could respond, the MC stepped forward, microphone in hand, his face flushed with the nervous relief of a man eager to return control to the program. He offered it to me, tilting it forward as if to say, "Here's your moment. Take it." But I shook my head. "Let the student speak," I said. My voice was calm, but it carried a firmness that left no room for negotiation. And so they did. 3 young people made their way to the front, their hands trembling slightly, but their eyes bright with something I recognized instantly, the fierce mix of fear and pride that comes when you're about to speak in a room that has been told, implicitly or explicitly, that your voice is not the standard. The first began haltingly, her words tinged with the music of a Caribbean shoreline. She spoke about studying late into the night, the sound of waves outside her window, replaced by the hum of a shared apartment in a city she could barely afford. The second, a tall boy with a voice full of West African cadence, told the story of teaching himself English by reading bus schedules and menus, learning the language not in classrooms, but in the rush of everyday survival. The third, a slight young man from Eastern Europe, spoke in a rhythm that was almost poetry, the consonants sharp, the vowels drawn like the breath before a song. Each voice was distinct. Each accent was undeniable, and each one, as it poured into the microphone, filled the room with a richness that made it impossible to cling to the idea that one way of speaking was better than another. When they finished, the applause came. Not scattered, not polite, but full and sustained. The kind that forces people to stand without even realizing they've risen. For those 3 minutes, the room had no hierarchy, no back rows, no invisible corners. It was a single space, bound together by voices that had always deserved to be heard exactly as they were. And as I stood off to the side, watching them take the place I had been denied for so long, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not victory exactly, but a deep, steadying sense of redress. What had been stolen from me tonight had been returned, not in the form of a spotlight, but in the form of a stage that no one could take from them now. Weeks later, long after the tables had been cleared and the crystal glasses stored away, I found myself standing in front of the scholarship office. The morning light was still soft, the campus quiet, except for the faint rustle of leaves. There, Mounted to the wall beside the door was a new bronze plaque. I stepped closer, the metal catching the sun in a way that made the letters seem carved from light itself, founded by voices that crossed oceans. Beneath it, my name. Every letter there, every syllable intact, no abbreviation, no trimming for convenience, no attempt to fold it into someone else's mouth. It was the same name my grandmother had whispered over me when I was a child, the same name my parents had defended when others tried to shorten it. The same name I had carried into this country through airports, checkpoints, and rooms where I was told it was too hard to say. Now, it was here, fixed in metal, unchangeable. I reached out and let my fingers rest against the cool surface, feeling the grooves of each letter. It struck me then that this was more than a plaque. It was a map, a proof of existence, a marker that said, this voice was here. This voice mattered. When the next banquet came, I arrived with no expectations, only curiosity. The hall looked the same, the chandeliers still catching the light, the tables still dressed in white, the MC still holding the evening's program. But there was one difference. I heard it before I even reached the stage. The MC was practicing my name under his breath, repeating it slowly, carefully, shaping the vowels until they sat in his mouth the way they were meant to. I watched his lips move, saw him pause after each attempt, and begin again. It wasn't perfect, but it was an effort born not of obligation, but of respect. When my turn came to speak, I stepped forward. The microphone felt familiar now, almost like an extension of my own voice. I greeted the room exactly as I had the year before, letting the sound carry the music of my country. And this time, no one laughed. No eyes darted sideways in amusement. No shoulders shook in quiet mockery. Instead, there was a stillness, not of disbelief, but of understanding. I saw it in their faces. They could hear the map in my voice now. They could trace the roads, the rivers, the borders it had crossed. And whether or not they'd walked that same terrain, they knew enough to honor it. I spoke, not to reclaim a space anymore, but to fill it fully. And when I left the stage, I knew the change was not temporary. The plaque on the wall outside the scholarship office would hold my name for years after I was gone. But even more lasting was what had happened inside this room. They had learned my voice, and in learning it, they could no longer pretend not to know me.